everyone, and welcome to Debating Metal. I'm your host, Kenneth Dean, the Dean of Metal, and along with my co-host, Chris Kaye, we discuss and dissect our favorite music, heavy metal. So sit back, relax, pop open a cold one, and let the debate begin. Welcome back. This is Debating Metal. I'm your host, Kenneth Dean, along with my co-host, Chris Kaye, and we're here for episode 5. It is going to be an action-packed episode. Not really. It's got just a lot of conversation that we're going to have. How are you today, Chris?
I'm doing pretty good.
We've got a lot to talk about today, and we've got our main topic is going to be musicians who went solo, and then later on we have a double Big Four for you, but we're not going to announce what it is. I want to start off with something real quick that I've been reading in the news lately, and that is this whole saga with Billy Sheehan and Van Halen. Are you aware of that?
I am. It's something that was just brought to my attention. It's kind of interesting.
Basically, so to go over what's going on, Billy Sheehan was interviewed recently for Metal Magazine, and they asked him if he was ever approached to join Van Halen. And his answer was, yes, I was approached 3 different times. A couple times in the 80s, one time in the 90s. He went up to jam with them. But then he comes back and gets upset about the fact that this magazine posted this article, saying that it was clickbait, that it was just a headline, but he never really was offered the job in Van Halen. Personally, I'd like to know the truth. Not that I really care in the end, because bottom line is he never did join Van Halen, but I just wonder why this is coming up now and then why he's backtracking, going back and forth.
It does seem interesting that sometimes these guys go back and bring up these stories. It's almost like they need something to be still relevant. I don't mean that in a mean way. I just, what's kind of the point of rehashing some of these stories like this?
Sometimes you're just being interviewed. A guy asks you, because Billy Sheehan's been in a lot of bands. I mean, obviously he was in Talis. He was in David Lee Roth.
So many bands.
Now he's currently with the Winery Dogs with Mike Portnoy and Richie Kotzen. His relevance is there. He's still a relevant musician. But the problem is you get these interviewers who want to either drudge up old stuff on these guys, or, for lack of a better term, make something up. And I don't think this is made up.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's so much clickbait, so much of these stories just to grab your attention that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the actual story.
Right. I mean, and Blabbermouth is really popular with that. That's what they're famous for, and their clickbait headlines. And you know what? I read Blabbermouth every single day, and it doesn't bother me, because I can look past those clickbait things, and but it does interest me. So I go, let me see what the article's about. I mean, there literally have been times where I've read the headline and it had nothing to do. Maybe one line had to do with the headline, but the whole story was something else.
Yeah.
And that's kind of annoying when I read it. With Billy, it being such a prolific bass player, I don't understand why he would go back and forth and backtrack. If you said it, you said it. I mean, if it happened, it happened. Right now,
if he's friends with Michael Anthony, though, he may not want to upset him, even though Michael's like the most chill guy ever.
Oh yeah, and I don't. You're also talking about something that happened in the '80s. For what it may have been worth, they may have had their disagreements with Michael back then, and who knows? But he stayed all the way through, the '90s, and then got basically the unceremonious boot. When they made the Best of Both Worlds greatest hits. So
even before that, with Van Halen 3, it was kind of limited use.
Right. They've been kind of weird about that, and it's just been kind of annoying, this whole Van Halen saga. And even now, is he sick? Is he not sick? He keeps popping up with a picture here and there. I don't, it keeps getting posted by someone in the family.
It's hard to really determine what's going on at any given time, and how many times has he flip-flopped on how he felt about the different lead singers of the band.
Mm-hmm.
How many times has he flip-flopped about just so many different things, his control habits of what goes into the album. I remember, I want to say it was Diver Down, he strategically removed the guitar string sounds on everything. Weird. I mean, we're lucky enough to get good music out of him, and luckily the 2012 A Different Truth was still a pretty great album.
It was. Best of luck to Van Halen. Hopefully he stays healthy. Eddie. Who knows if the band will come back. If they do, great. Hopefully they come back in their prime or in the best shape possible. Maybe they'll put out an album. Maybe they won't. Who knows? As far as all that's concerned, we need to move on to our main subject today, and it's musicians who went solo. And this one's going to be a little bit different. It's going to be more of our conversation that we've been trying to have and going back and forth and debating some stuff. We're talking about guys like, and just to give a brief list, Ace Frehley, Zakk Wylde, Bruce Dickinson, David Lee Roth, Jeff Tate, Sebastian Bach, all these guys who either been fired or quit their bands to go solo and either did or didn't go back to the bands or did something else or maybe even created a new band. With that said, who would you like to talk about first?
I mean, I got to go with my boy Bruce.
Bruce Dickinson, Iron Maiden.
Yeah, I mean, he had a solo album really before he left Iron Maiden.
Right.
He did a Tattooed Millionaire. That was mostly kind of based on the fact that he was doing Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter. For
Freddy's Nightmare?
Freddy's Nightmare, yeah. They just kind of went from there. They started recording more music. It was different stuff than Iron Maiden. So, you know, he just put out an album. And then, what was it, 92? He left...
He left in 93.
93, officially after the tour for Fear of the Dark.
Mm-hmm.
Wanted to go in a different direction, kind of, you know, still rock, but it put out Balls to Picasso, a little more different than Iron Maiden for sure. And then went not long after that with the Skunk Works thing.
Yeah, that was weird.
Yeah, well,
it was
supposed to be a band. I mean, he wanted to create the band Skunk Works, and what ended up happening was the label wouldn't put the album out under the name Skunk Works
because Bruce is the marquee.
Yeah, and he's so big. Even back then, I mean, it was just huge with Iron Maiden, and they needed that name.
Right. No, they needed name power just to get him out there.
Yeah. So,
but the Skunk Works in a nutshell was a failure.
It was grunge.
Yeah,
and it wasn't what we expected out of Bruce.
No, not at all.
So his fan base wasn't there. It'd be like starting over.
Mm-hmm. But he hooked up with Roy Z, and that was a good thing.
Well, he actually did Balls to Picasso with Roy Z first.
Well, that's right.
That way they already had the relationship. But then they did the two following albums. Accident of Birth and Chemical Wedding, which were
those were excellent.
Yeah,
those were great albums.
It was very heavy albums.
Very heavy, and there was a big factor about those albums that was different from Balls to Picasso, because Balls to Picasso was that Tribe of Gypsies type of.
Yeah, it was rock. It was a hard rock album.
Where with Roy Z, he took most of the band, but and did Balls to Picasso.
Adrian Smith was brought on board.
Adrian Smith was the key to Accident of Birth and Chemical Wedding. Mm-hmm. That was huge. The songwriting, you could see that Adrian and Bruce had a great partnership as far as songwriting was concerned. And you throw in Roy Z, who's a great producer, great songwriter himself, and that's why those two albums are awesome.
Oh, they're fantastic. Even the following album, after he rejoined Iron Maiden, Tyranny of Souls, which was just with Roy Z, Adrian Smith didn't participate in that album. But it was a great album. Very enjoyable.
Yeah, and I mean, again, it's a testament to Roy Z and how good of a guitar player and how good of a songwriter he is.
And they have good chemistry, too.
Yes. And supposedly there's going to be a fourth one.
Which, if Eternity Should Fail...
It's supposed to
be on that one because it was originally written for a Bruce solo album.
Right. So Bruce Dickinson went solo 1993.
Very successful.
Had, you would say, a relatively successful career, even though it was predominantly a club-based career.
It was, but overseas, I mean, he did pretty well.
Yes. And his biggest achievement overseas was playing in Sarajevo during the war. They currently have a documentary that came out called Scream for Me Sarajevo, which documents the time that he went there basically through enemy lines to try and get this concert played.
Yep.
And after everybody told him no, after everybody backed out on him, him and the band said, we're moving forward.
But Bruce is just that kind of guy. He does what he wants to do. I mean, he flies the plane for Iron Maiden.
That's so cool.
He's just that energetic guy, and he stands by his convictions, and that's why I've always respected Bruce.
Bruce
I love
is
him
awesome.
as the leader of Iron Maiden. And I don't mean that like everybody knows that Steve is the de facto leader, but the front man, the guy that gives the energy to the crowd, that's always going to be Bruce.
Yeah. And I was actually just today listening to a Chris Jericho podcast where he was talking to Adrian Smith, and they were talking about when Bruce came back to the band in 1999, he almost took on a greater role as being that front man.
I can see that. For sure.
You just imagine how good he was back then, and now all of a sudden, he's taking a bigger role of being an even more. How can you say a bigger show? How can he be a bigger showman than what he already was?
Well, it only makes sense. I mean, you think about it. Like when he was in Iron Maiden the first time, that was a collaborative effort. It was a band, and they had been working together, and he wasn't in the original lineup. He was brought in. Mm-hmm. So at that point, he didn't own the band, but when he went off on his own for, was it almost 10 years?
No, it was 6 because he came back in 99. So.
Well, I mean, he played before he left.
Well, he played before he left, but it wasn't like but
that was what I mean is it was still his project,
right? Yeah. I mean, so that was from 1990 to 99. So
he had
years.
The ownership there,
mm-hmm. Right?
And when he's out, being the leader of the band, because nobody else had that kind of prestige within the band, he developed himself.
Yeah, if anybody's been out has gone to see the Legacy of the Beast tour, they would know exactly what we're talking about when it comes to the fact that he has become the great showman.
Oh yeah.
And I mean, if whoever hasn't seen that tour, you missed out, because it's probably not coming back to the United States in that same form. All right, so we talked about Bruce Dickinson and Iron Maiden. Who else do we want to talk about now?
Why don't we talk about Ace Frehley, my favorite Kiss member?
He's your favorite Kiss member?
Oh yeah, he's my favorite.
Why?
He's just so entertaining. He's got that great laugh. He's just such a out there guy. The spaceman is the perfect description of him.
Yeah, for sure. Ace Frehley, fourth member of Kiss. He's one of the original 4 founding members of Kiss. Played with them from 1973 through 1980.
That's short of a period of time.
81, actually, because he played with them on the Elder album and then did a very small tour with them. But by that time, he was pretty much on the outs. He did not record Creatures of the Night, even though his face is on the cover. And he did promo. I mean, he was on the video for I Love It Loud. He did promo work for him, but he was not on the album, and he was not going to tour, and he was already out of the band.
Well, that's kind of interesting. I guess Kiss kind of had that going for them, where Peter Criss didn't record with them, right, on a few albums, or
he didn't record,
limited amount on some of them.
He didn't record anything on Unmasked because they didn't put one of his songs on there. He did, I think, one song, "Dirty Livin'," on Dynasty. And that was the only thing that he played on. Everything else was Anton Fig.
So I guess in that respect, Ace probably still was part of the band, even though he didn't record anything to a degree.
With Creatures?
Yeah.
No, he quit.
He quit already by that time.
Yeah, he had
So
quit.
why was he doing the promo work?
Because they hadn't announced that he was gone.
Okay.
And for what I believe, it was probably more embarrassment. They didn't want to upheaval again. I mean, just 2 years later, after Peter Criss had left the band, they hadn't found a permanent replacement. Vinny, because they didn't make Vinny a member officially until Creatures was out.
So he still stuck around for a little bit, even after he quit?
Yes.
Was that contractual obligation, or?
I don't know the exact details as to why.
That's interesting.
Yeah, but he basically helped them out.
They're kind of a confusing band in that way. Their history is so elaborate.
Kiss is weird. We're gonna do what I call career episodes. We're going to talk about the careers of Kiss, Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, all those classic bands, and those will be nice long episodes. And
that'll be fun.
Yeah, Kiss is definitely going to be one of them, if not the first one we talk about.
If not in eras.
So Ace Frehley wrote a bunch of music with Kiss, and then didn't sing with them from 74 to 77. It was the first time he sang. He sang "Shock Me," even though he had written "Cold Gin." He had written several of their bigger songs at the time, but didn't want to sing. Finally, they convinced him to sing. He Shock Me was a hit for Kiss. I guess not necessarily on the charts, but with the fans. But that led him to want to do more solo stuff. And
there's actually a really kind of a cool story of how he recorded Shock Me.
Uh-huh.
Do you know about that one?
Yeah.
So he was so nervous about recording the audio, the vocals for "Shock Me," that Gene was telling him, you got to do it. You got to do it. You got to sing this song." And he finally agreed to do it, but he was so nervous about it, he laid on his back on the ground and recorded with the mic aimed down at him.
I think I did hear about that story.
That's pretty funny.
I'm probably sure I read it over the years, but I've read so much stuff from Kiss. I mean, I've been a fan of theirs since I was 8 years old. So, I've read, book after book after book, and I have a whole bunch of books. But yeah, he was a shy one. And you would not know that now from everything that's going on.
Especially seeing the Tom Snyder interview.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Basically, between one thing and another, with drugs and alcohol being the big problem with Ace and Kiss, he ends up leaving the band to go do his solo stuff in 1982. Shortly thereafter, he's trying to put together a band. He puts together a band called Frehley's Comet. That doesn't come out, that the band doesn't actually release an album until 1987.
It's a long period of time.
Yeah, so he was trying to do something. First, he was trying to get his act together. That was one thing. Second, he was trying to put the guys in the band together. Once he finally did that, they were able to sit down, record, and create an album. And that album ended up being called Frehley's Comet, even though it was Ace Frehley as a solo artist. Frehley's Comet was the title of the album.
Kind of like how Ozzy
and Blizzard of Oz
was Blizzard of Oz, and then.
But the next album for Ace Frehley and Frehley's Comet was a Frehley's Comet album.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so he did make it a band, even though there were some changes immediately thereafter. Anton Fig was the drummer on the album, Frehley's Comet, but did not tour. He did a couple of shows, did not tour, quit, and then they had, I think, a guy named Jamie Odelmaker, I think was his name. Became the regular drummer. So Ace's career since leaving Kiss has had its ups and downs. He has, with his substance abuse and his struggles with that to stay clean, had some issues. He has remained clean, as far as I know, for the last 20-something years, which is really good.
He's been pretty vocal about it.
Right, and that's been a little bit of his issue with Kiss, because they keep harping on the fact that he's not responsible, not reliable, but yet
something that happened years ago.
Right, exactly. Much like we mentioned earlier, there are guys on this list that have gone and come back. And Ace Frehley came back in 1995 to Kiss during the reunion.
Was that before the Psycho Circus?
That was before Psycho Circus.
They did a brief reunion, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. What happened was they did the MTV Unplugged. That was a culmination. What had happened in 1995, there was a lot of independent, private, what they would call Kiss conventions. They would go to different hotels, and people would sell their memorabilia. Basically, like it was a Kiss Con, if you want to call it that.
Fans getting together.
So they were doing this a lot, and I've been to one. I saw Peter Criss, I seen Eric Singer, and so they would sell videos, they would sell all sorts of memorabilia. Finally, Kiss kind of got a hold of this and say, listen, no, you can't use the Kiss name. They kind of halted the Kiss convention, and then they did their own. And they basically did a traveling tour during the summer of 1995, going to different places. And what they did was they had a walking...
Gene being the ultimate opportunist.
Exactly. And you know what? It worked for them, because what they did was they had this traveling road show. There was a traveling museum. They put stuff that you couldn't get at the Kiss conventions because it belonged to them. And then they had a Kiss tribute band open up the show, which was really cool because they came out full makeup, old. I don't know if Kiss lent them the wardrobe or not, but they had a different Kiss tribute band in all the different cities.
Like Santa Claus in the malls.
Exactly. So they've got all these Kiss guys, so like if they would come to Houston, I think they would probably pick Kiss alike. That's the big Houston tribute band that plays here.
Shout out to the local bands.
Shout out to all the local guys here. Now, they would go to show, and they have Kiss tribute open up the show, and then they'd have a break, and then Kiss would come out and play an acoustic set. So they would play, and it was by request. They said it was by request, but when you were there, you really kind of understood it wasn't by request, because if you look at the list of songs they played, every show was the same set with one or two.
Who would have known that back then?
Right. They would play the acoustic set, and then after that, they had this basically free-for-all autograph session. Whatever you wanted to get autographed, you just had to basically bum rush the stage and hand it to them, and they would sign it. And they made a ton of money on it. That led to the MTV Unplugged that they filmed for MTV, and then they invited Peter and Ace to do some of the songs on that show. That led to the reunion. It was later in 95, 96. They went on tour with the reunion, and then after the tour, then it was the Psycho Circus album, which, for lack of a better term, was a monumental failure because all the problems that were part of Kiss and those four guys resurfaced because they wanted this and they wanted this credit and they wanted that song to be on the album and why can't I play this? Why can't so it was just like, you know what? They went on tour, they had this miserable tour, and it became the farewell tour because Paul Stanley was so disenchanted with how everything was going. He's like, I don't want to do this anymore. I mean, that's how bad it was. And then midway through, Peter Criss couldn't hack it for whatever reason. I say he couldn't hack it. Maybe he didn't want to. He left.
He just didn't want to continue.
Eric Singer came back into the band. Then Ace Frehley was the only guitar, was the other guy left, and he came back and forth. He became unreliable and would literally just, I'm not going to play the show. So Tommy Thayer, who had been working for Kiss for several years and was one of the main people who set up the Kiss convention, he was the one who basically would step in and play Ace Frehley, eventually becoming
which he continues to do today.
The permanent role as Ace Frehley. So that's where we're at with that. Ace has gone on to have a relatively, for lack of a better term, mediocre solo career. I mean, he's had his ups and downs. He's had pretty decent albums. It's nothing that was
club level.
Definitely club level, and he's
a faithful fan base.
Yes.
Great. He seems like a pretty great guy.
He's pretty cool.
Yeah, he's hysterical.
Yes, he's a funny dude.
But not on the level that he was with Kiss.
No. And one thing that I've always feel bad about, like I mentioned, I don't know if it was last episode or the episode before, there was always that Randy Rhoads, Eddie Van Halen, and Ace Frehley battle in the 80s. And I always wondered why they would include Ace Frehley. If you're a big Kiss fan like I was back then, Ace Frehley was the shit. He was your guitar player because you wanted to see that dude who was larger than life with the smoke bombs coming out of his guitars and the fireworks and all that. In reality, if you listen to the playing, it never improved.
But I think it was more than that. I mean, he exactly what you said, larger than life. Mm-hmm. The image that was there was inspirational to a lot of people, a lot of kids growing up playing guitar.
For sure.
And he was the guy that made them want to play guitar.
Oh yeah.
And I think it's more on that level than maybe the playing, the quality of the playing.
Right.
It's just, that image that, I mean, you mentioned it when we first started this, when you were talking about when you saw Kiss the first time on a commercial, on how that stuck in your mind.
Oh, it totally sucked you in.
Yeah. And I mean, people had that same reaction when they saw Eddie play Eruption, that guitar that just memorable, the red guitar with the white and the black stripes, those images that people see. And I don't necessarily mean all connected, but just those things that people see that stick in their mind, and they're the guy that inspired them to play. And Ace definitely has that.
Oh, for sure. I mean, he definitely, he probably helped. Dimebag has a tattoo of Ace on his arm.
And was buried with Eddie's.
He was buried with Eddie's guitar. So those are the kinds of things. He was buried in a Kiss casket. Dimebag was a huge Ace Frehley fan. Oh, Scott Ian is a huge Kiss fan.
And you can't discount the factor of some of these guys when they go on their solo gigs and they're super successful or just, in the middle. They still have their huge influence on a lot of people.
Oh yeah.
And I mean, I can't tell you how exciting it is to see some of these guys live.
Oh yeah, I mean, what was cool when I was living in Miami, there was a time, the 90s were not kind to hair metal bands, and
to say the least.
And what was really cool, I got to see Cinderella play a club. I got to see Dokken play a club. I got to see Badlands play a club. Badlands being Jakey Lee's solo band with Ray Gillen. I got to see Saigon Kick in a club. And actually, all four of those bands in the same club. It was the Button South in Hollandale Beach, Florida. And that club tops 2,000 people. And 2,000 is kind of shoving them in there. Mm-hmm. And from what I found out later on, they stuffed almost 2,700 people for Saigon Kick because that's how maniacal everybody was for their local band. I've seen Ace Frehley and Peter Criss at the Button South. It is so cool to see a band that close, especially, they're essentially stripped down. I mean, there was no show. There was no fireworks. There was no flames. There was a small little, 1 foot riser and the band right in front of you.
Yeah.
And that's an awesome
about
experience.
10, 20 feet. Maybe, it had to have been about 10 feet from Yngwie Malmsteen. It's just so cool to be that close.
Oh, yeah.
And see all of it.
Yeah, I mean, and after the Dawkins show, me and the guy I was with, him and I hung out waiting for the band, and we got them to sign a poster. All 4 of them signed it. It was pretty cool. We had to wait the longest. I believe it was for George Lynch. He just would not come onto that bus. But he finally did. And I even got a Wild McBrown stick that night. So it was pretty cool. So Ace Frehley's solo career was up and down for the most part. He's still touring. He's done a couple of albums recently. So he's still putting out music. Some of it new. He just did a covers album a couple of years ago. That went well. He actually had Paul sing on it, and he collaborated with Gene Simmons on his new record for a song, the one that came out after the covers album. So he has that relationship with them, but they don't want to do business with him. And you know what? For what it is, it's better that way.
Yeah, I'd rather get something good rather than something dreadful that a project that falls apart.
Right, exactly. You don't want another Psycho Circus.
Yeah.
So we've talked about Bruce. We've talked about Ace Frehley. Who's next on the list?
Why don't we talk about Glenn Danzig?
Very good choice. I like Glenn.
Okay, so I'm sure you're all familiar with the Misfits.
Mm-hmm.
Big punk band. Not metal, certainly. Towards the end of their career with Glenn Danzig, he became very dissatisfied with doing punk. It wasn't the direction he wanted to continue to go. He quit the band and formed a project called Sawin, which is with which most people would read as Sam Hain. It was a little bit of a transition because you can kind of hear those hard rock elements along with the punk vibe, but not exactly where he wanted to go. And the project was kind of falling apart. He was pretty much at the end of the rope there, and Rick Rubin happened to be at what would be their last show and said, "Hey, we want to sign you." He was willing to do it, but only if he could bring along...
Was it Chuck?
No, it wasn't Chuck Biscuits, but it was...
John Christ? Not him either? So it was one person left, I guess, the bass player.
What was his name? Erie Vaughn.
Erie Vaughn. Okay. Wasn't in the Misfits?
No, he was in Sewing.
Oh, okay.
So he wanted to bring Erie Vaughn along. They agreed to it. They started the Danzig project. Now, interesting note here. Danzig Skull that was on the Samhain albums as well was actually ripped off from an old Marvel Crystar comic book cover.
Oh, yes. I remember that. I've seen those pictures.
Yes. So it's never quite really been addressed. But yeah, it's actually from one of my favorite Batman cover artists, Michael Golden.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, it's interesting, but it's never been really brought up.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen the image where it comes from, and when I saw it, I say, hey, that's Danzig's skull, and then I was one of those things. I guess he either borrowed it or asked to borrow it, and whatever, and it became synonymous with him. Who knows? I mean,
yeah, it's just on the background behind the main characters on the cover.
So maybe that's why no one's said anything about it.
Yep. But so basically, he wanted to move towards more of a metal direction. The first album was pretty hard rock metal, heavy.
That first album was real good. It was real
yeah.
good. I mean, my favorite song off of that is Twist of Cain.
Yeah, very cool song. I mean, it had a number of hits. Mother being, the big one.
But that didn't become a hit for what, another 2 years, 3 years or something.
Yeah, it took some time to really take off.
It didn't become a hit till '93, so that was 5 years later.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, on that live VP that he did, was it Thrall, Demon Sweat, something like that?
Well, what's interesting too is that there was a parental sticker on that album, and there's really no cursing. It was one word with whore.
Hua.
And I mean, it really was just because of the content of the lyrics,
right? Or what they thought.
What they thought it was evil, and
Yeah.
But for someone to transition from a completely different genre of music, and yeah, you get the influences there. I mean, obviously the Misfits influenced a lot of people, including Metallica.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they did a few covers of their songs.
Metallica, Guns N' Roses.
Guns N' Roses. So, I mean, it's just interesting to see these guys go from one successful career. And he had a dip in the middle with a project that didn't really go anywhere, but Danzig has been, fairly consistently successful.
Yeah, I mean, he had his successes. I mean, I've seen him twice in concert back in the early days. I mean, I think it was on his Danzig 3 album tour that he did. So he definitely had a career, or has a career, and it definitely slowed down. But he's recently just reunited with the Misfits in the last couple of years, and they've played some on and off gigs.
Yeah, bigger shows than they had in a long time,
yeah.
Especially with their smattering of replacement singers themselves.
Yeah, and I think that they culminated their reunion with the Madison Square Garden show, which I don't think 20, 30 years ago they would have even imagined playing Madison Square Garden as a punk band out of from California, right?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, so it wasn't something that I think either one of them thought about, but they became, big enough to do Madison Square Garden all those years later.
Yeah, I love seeing these bands get their stuff together and actually be able to reunite with the original lineups and put on a good show. I mean, a lot of fans, that's who they grew up with, that's who they want to hear, and luckily sometimes it does come together. And yeah, it's not exactly the original lineup, but it's the classic lineup. It's the one everybody knows.
Yep. So Danzig is still playing, and I don't know if he's going to stay with the Misfits. I think he doesn't want to. But I mean, at this point, it almost seems like a cash grab for me.
Well, they've done their stuff. I mean, they're a nostalgia act for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, they haven't put out a new album since. I mean, I wouldn't even say new album, because they've put new albums out with the other singer, and they had a career that way. As far as Danzig is concerned, they hadn't done anything since probably 1980 or something like that.
Yeah, somewhere around there. Yeah.
So really, so it's not even. With them not putting out new music, they're definitely a nostalgia act. That's what people want to see. So, and I don't know anything about what they've been playing in concert to say it's completely nostalgia as far as Glenn is concerned. But they definitely are touring off of something, and it has to be off of their old stuff with Glenn.
He left in '83.
Okay, so '83. So.
Yeah, because they didn't even release anything until after 1980. Walk Among Us and Earth AD were really the only releases. I mean, then they did the collections and stuff like that, where they had a lot of songs that were outside of albums.
Yeah, I mean, all those little, those singles.
I mean, they're punk.
Yeah,
I mean, that's kind of a trend of that genre of music.
That's what they do. They just put out singles because no one wants to put a whole album out.
They don't have the energy or the time.
It's only 5 minutes long because every song is only 10 seconds.
Yeah, well, I mean, the albums are only equate to 17 minutes.
Yeah. I'll never forget that. Quick story. The first time I had a friend of mine, my best friend in high school, his name was George Odishu. Him and we went to Sam Goody to go buy a record. I think it was he wanted to buy a record, and we come across the A section. I don't think it was separated by metal or punk or anything like that. And we came across this all black album. And he says, I'm going to get that one. And it ended up being Agnostic Front.
I was going to say Spinal Tap.
It probably would. It was already out. But it was Agnostic Front. We didn't know anything about it. He kind of liked the name of the band because it was on the little sticker. We bought it. We got home. We went to my house to listen to it. We were listening to my stereo, and 15 minutes later, it was over. I'm like, was that both sides you played? I mean, do it again. It was really, really short. We just felt like we got ripped off. I'm like, and I didn't understand. That's one of the reasons why I don't like punk. I couldn't understand it whatsoever. I mean, the vocal phrasing was just out of control. I mean, it was so fast, so undiscernible to me. I mean, I'd rather listen to death metal.
But, I would, of course, I'd rather listen to death metal.
I mean, it was just one of those things where I never got into punk. And I didn't know anything about the Ramones to know that the Ramones were a completely different style of punk. I was in high school and I had paid zero attention to the Ramones. I mean, I was a metalhead, nowhere near punk. Although I knew about them, but didn't listen to them, didn't think they had anything to do with me. Which is weird how Kiss later on does a Ramones cover.
I think just about everybody at Children of Bodom's done a Ramones cover.
Oh. So we're going to go ahead and talk about Slash now.
Okay.
And Slash, Guns N' Roses, he, Saul Hudson from England, Stoke-on-Trent, England, as he so eloquently named an album after where he was born. He left Guns N' Roses in, I think it was 1995.
Under great circumstances.
Yeah. Thank you, Axl. I mean, it became a situation where Axl was just a control freak. And one by one, everybody left.
Yeah, I mean, he made Slash apologize to the audience at one point for doing drugs and not putting on his best performance. So rough times there.
Yeah, it was weird. It was a weird time in the 80s. I mean, excuse me, the 90s for Guns N' Roses. I mean, they did Spaghetti Incident, and I think that was the last thing they did. The last thing they did was the Sympathy for the Devil song that they did for the soundtrack. And then that was it. Everybody just went their separate ways. Axl kept the name. Didn't keep the logo, though. As you can tell, 15 years later, Chinese Democracy comes out and Guns N' Roses logo is completely different. Slash and Duff and Axl kept the logo, kept the name. So basically, Axl was licensing Guns N' Roses from Slash and Duff. Slash goes on to do solo records. He did Slash's Snake Pit. And then
which is a really cool project.
It's 5 o'clock somewhere.
Yeah. He I remember him saying, I want to say on that metal show years ago, they talked about who was the better band, Slash's Snake Pit or Velvet Revolver. And it really came down to the fact that Slash felt that Snake Pit was a solo project. It was never a band.
Oh, really? Mm-hmm. Okay. What was his Snake Pit?
Yeah.
So then after Slash's Snake Pit, he comes and he puts this, years later, a solo album out with many different guest artists to help him out. And one of the ones that was helping him out.
Was that the double album that had some live recordings, the second disc? Or was this...
I think that came out as a special edition.
Yeah, afterward. Okay. Yeah, I'm definitely aware of that album.
So he puts out this album and it's got... I mean, they did a cover of Paradise City with Cypress Hill and Fergie. But that's where he met Miles Kennedy.
Very different.
Yeah. Miles Kennedy did a couple songs on that album. After that, I think that relationship he tried to get Miles to join Velvet when he was doing Velvet Revolver.
So he was still pretty committed to Alter Bridge, though.
I believe at the time he had just started Alter Bridge, and so that he wanted to make that his main focus.
Yeah, he didn't want
to. So he didn't want to do that. But yeah, so with all the years in between, because after Snake Pit and he went solo, he joins Velvet, or he forms Velvet with Duff and Matt Scott Weiland, and then Kushner was the other guitar player. So then after Weiland gets thrown out of the band again, another band he gets kicked out of. That's when
it's really unfortunate.
It is, but that's
worked out.
Those are the results of a destructive life, I guess you could say that way.
The same thing we were talking about with Ace Frehley.
Right, exactly. So it's unfortunate. So Slash puts out, he does a couple albums with Velvet Revolver, and then in 2010 he puts out Slash's solo album. That's where he meets Miles. After that, Miles doesn't want to join Velvet, but Slash, since Velvet was basically on hiatus, they didn't know what they were going to do. Slash decides to put another solo record out. And this time he's like, I want you to sing on it, and talking about Miles. And then one thing led to another. The band members the musicians that they pulled in were all friends. They became Slash featuring Miles Kennedy and the Conspirators. It's a very long band name, but that is the official band name. It's not Slash. It's it's about Miles and it's about the Conspirators, and there are some good musicians in that band.
It's a really different than the other bands they have. Obviously it's different than Guns N' Roses. Mm-hmm. But Slash was always going to have his Slash sound,
right?
And it's different than Alter Bridge if you're a fan of that band.
Oh, so way different.
Yeah, it's a really interesting project for both of them, where you're getting a fully different experience. So don't feel like if you don't like one or the other, that you won't like this band, I'd say definitely give it a try.
You talking about Alter Bridge? Or?
Yeah, if you're not a big Alter Bridge fan, or say you're not a big Guns N' Roses fan, you know, don't discount this band because it's very different.
No, Slash featuring Myles Kennedy and the Conspirators, they've put out 3 albums. Everyone thinks it's just 3 Slash solo albums, but they're not. They're 3 band albums, and they keep getting better and better every time, to the point where when they had only released 2 albums, and then The World on Fire was the second album that they put out in 2014. Right after that, they announced in 2016, after the completion of the world tour for World on Fire, they announced a reunion of Guns N' Roses, which has not stopped touring since 2016, which is pretty amazing. I mean, to be on the Not in This Lifetime tour for 4 years is pretty impressive.
For those few of albums to support that long of a tour, it's pretty amazing.
Talk about living off of one album. I mean, yes, they put out 3 studio albums. We'll give them that. Or 4 with the covers album, but that's a covers album. It's an amazing career to be literally living off of Appetite for Destruction. One of the things for Slash was he wanted to make sure, he told his fans, he told Myles, he told the band, they were going to put another album out. And after one of the tours was over for Guns N' Roses, he put out their 3rd album, Living the Dream, which I mean, again, everyone got better. So Living the Dream is a pretty good album. I listened to it the other day, and it's really good rocker. I mean, it's a straight ahead hard rock album, and so they're still going. They did some touring, and now it's back to the Guns N' Roses.
Well, I think Slash has to have that creative outlet. He's not necessarily getting a creative outlet with Guns, but he's getting something different from that. You know, those are his songs. Those are a big part of his history. So he's getting kind of the best of both worlds.
Right. And so is Myles, because Myles is, you know, full-time with both bands, with Slash and full-time with Alter Bridge. And now
he's very versatile, so he probably needs that.
And it's funny because he sings differently for both bands. Mm-hmm. He's a little more nasally when it comes to Slash. Mm-hmm. He's a little bit more harder edged when it comes to Alter Bridge. And I really enjoy Alter Bridge myself. I know you do. Mm-hmm. And they've definitely come into their own style.
Yeah, I over time I've really, especially the first album was cool. It was very Creed-like, which I'm not a fan of Creed at all. But it was still enjoyable because I really like Myles Kennedy's voice. Mm-hmm. But they've gotten heavier.
They've definitely gotten heavier.
I haven't given the newest album enough listens to really give it much of a critique, but the last few were a lot heavier, and I really liked them.
Yeah, to me, like you said, the first album, Open Your Eyes, is it Open Your Eyes? I think.
One Day Remains.
One Day Remains, correct. Open Your Eyes was the single.
That's the big single, yeah.
That album, One Day Remains, was essentially, to me, it almost felt like it was a leftover Creed album.
I mean, yeah,
in some degree.
In some ways, yeah, but it wasn't written that way, but it was the same guys writing music, so you can't just say like they're just automatically gonna sound like a different band,
right? You know,
but Myles' influence and him being a guitar player as well, mm-hmm. He brings in another factor into that band, which makes them.
I mean, specifically that song. Open Your Eyes, to me, is definitely a leftover Creed song that maybe Scott didn't want to sing, but I could see Scott singing it, Scott Stapp from Creed. But the rest of the album...
I would never want to see that.
the album was very good. I mean, so a lot of people thought it was like Creed with a new band and a new singer, but from the second album on, more from the third album on, when they really got into their own groove and they totally went away from what they did before. And now that has a lot to do with Mark Tremonti really being more of a heavy metal guy. He's not this alternative, grungy, alt metal kind of guitar
player. If you've
player.
Listened to any of his solo stuff, mm-hmm. he's a lot heavier there too.
So Slash, Myles Kennedy and the Conspirators, continuing to be a band, even though it comes under Slash's, name. So who do you want to talk about next?
Well, let's talk about the late, great Ronnie James Dio.
Ronnie.
I mean, as we all know, he served in Black Sabbath. Prior to that, he was in Rainbow. Mm-hmm. So he'd done multiple projects with other people. He'd been in music for a long time. He was in Ronnie and the Red Caps, so he really had kind of a solo thing at the beginning. But that wasn't certainly metal. And then he did Elf.
How hard was Elf? Because I don't think I meant to listen to him the other day, and I didn't get a chance to.
Elf is very light. You would think like almost some kind of Led Zeppelin-y elements.
Okay.
But not hard. You can tell like he's going in that direction. It's not as hard as Rainbow.
Wow. Okay.
So less so there.
So 60s-ish, you know.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, he started doing music in the 50s. I mean, he did doo-wop,
Right.
And then he went into folky rock, and then
Right.
and then those elements came back later, especially working with guys like Ritchie Blackmore. Where he's got his own kind of Renaissance kind of feel.
He's a Renaissance man, all right.
Yeah. So yeah, he worked with Black Sabbath. Was pretty successful there, even though it was a short period of time. 1980 to 83, I believe, was the total time he was in the band.
Not even. I think he left in late 82.
Was that
I think
Live Evil was 81 or 82?
Live Evil was 82.
Okay, so yeah, it was 3 years in the band.
Because I think Born Again, Born Again
was 83.
Was 83.
Yeah, so you've got a really short period of time, but a very memorable period of time with Black Sabbath. Working with these temperamental musicians that he wasn't as much in control of the band, and he's a temperamental musician himself. He needed a solo project. And yeah, Dio's a band, but we all know that Dio is Ronnie James Dio.
Right, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, they had several albums at the beginning. What is it, 3 albums with the same
With the original lineup, it was 3 albums.
Yeah, but then things changed. So, and from there on, it's a pretty inconsistent. Some of the guys playing on this album, then coming back a few albums later, like Simon Wright, Vinny Appice, just interchangeable guys that all loved working with him, but weren't going to be consistently in the band. So it was really a solo project, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, it started out as a band. It was meant to be a band, and they played like a band. I mean, obviously, they're together for 3 albums.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't even call it creative differences. It was basically business problems popped up because the other 3 guys thought they were a band.
Yeah.
And, it ended up being where Ronnie was kind of getting more and more of the control. And that had to do with Wendy.
It has so many parallels with Ozzy. It's so funny.
Yeah, it is very funny.
And I think that's why they didn't always mesh very well. Like, they weren't really good friends or anything. They were so much alike in a lot of ways.
There was mutual respect, but they weren't friends. That may have had to do with Sharon as well, because Sharon I don't think she has a lot of friends. Business associates. Lots of business associates.
So Ronnie does his first album, which was Holy Diver. Huge album.
That's a great album.
It really is. It's got Holy Diver, the song on it.
Mm-hmm. Stand Up and
Shout. Just track after track of just really hard-hitting songs. And a lot, I guess, he had a lot to prove leaving Black Sabbath, especially after only 2 albums.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So for him to have such a good career afterwards was pretty impressive.
Oh, I mean, he maintained his career, throughout the entire time when he left Black Sabbath, creates Dio. He maintained that band the entire time, except for a short period of time where he went back to Black Sabbath in 94. And then it was, again, another one-off. Not that he wanted it to be a one-off, but it came down to that whole thing with Ozzy, and Ozzy wanting Black Sabbath to open up for him for the final tour, final show. And Ronnie said no, and that kind of put the kibosh on the Black Sabbath thing. And then years later, Black Sabbath reunites with Ozzy, and then for whatever reason, they kind of go on hiatus, or the Ozfests kind of die down, and Heaven and Hell. I mean, basically, Ronnie joins Black Sabbath again.
Yeah, they did a Black Sabbath run.
But rather than continue with it as Black Sabbath, because the Ozzy version was getting so popular, they split off and they made Heaven and Hell. Mm-hmm. And that was basically the last thing he did before passing away.
Yeah.
And Heaven and Hell was a great record. Not like the Heaven and Hell album that came out with Black Sabbath, but still a very solid record. I mean, it was a modern day Black Sabbath record.
It was a return to form.
Yeah. There was
I would
some
say
really
certainly more so than Dehumanizer was. Dehumanizer wasn't as strong of an album as Heaven. I mean, the Heaven and Hell of the Devil You Know.
Right. But what's weird is that song, Eating the Cannibals, which is off of The Devil You Know, sounds very reminiscent to something that's off of Dehumanizer.
And it may have been
almost
something
seems
that
like
was
an
left
extension.
over.
Could
Yeah.
be.
I mean, we all know, Van Halen reused older riffs, older tracks from, they re-recorded everything, but they put older material on a different kind of truth. So, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. They're holding on to these.
Oh, if you got
riffs,
a good song is a good song, no matter when it was written. But yeah, Dio's solo career as an artist, I mean, from Holy Diver all the way to Master of the Moon, was as prolific as you can possibly get.
Well, those last 3 or 4 albums were a little different. He kind of went off in a more like Dungeons and Dragons kind of storytelling direction. It was kind of hit or miss for a lot of fans.
It was. I mean, some of the songs were good. I mean, I listened to Killing the Dragon the other day. There's some pretty good songs on there.
Yeah.
I was like, wow, I hadn't heard it. I never had listened to it. I kind of lost touch with Dio after Strange Highways, and even Lock Up the Wolves. I wasn't into that stuff. I mean, he got...
Lock Up of the Wolves was the first one that had a completely different band.
Right. That one... It was 1990, so all of a sudden things started going, grungy, and he was still Dio, and so he was not getting the same crowd as he was getting before. So people were beginning to look at him as a fossil, as a dinosaur.
Yeah, well, 93, I mean, he brought back Vinny Appice, so it was a little bit more, a little closer to the original lineup.
Right.
That was Strange Highways.
Strange Highways.
I think he was one of those guys that just needed to stick to his guns. He did for most of his career, and we all love him for it.
Oh yeah, I mean
he's got 2 tribute bands going right now.
Yeah, he does.
And there's hundreds of tribute bands, but the 2 big ones,
well,
Last in Line.
The Last in Line, and I don't even consider the Last in Line as a tribute band because it's actually the original Dio band. Mm-hmm. Well, obviously minus Dio and minus Jimmy Bain because he passed away. Yeah. It was meant to be the original Dio band doing Dio songs, but they've actually come out. I don't know if they're on their 2nd or 3rd album now. Mm-hmm. Definitely know they did 2. So they're making new music, which is cool. You know, so Vinny and Vivian are together flying the torch for Ronnie James Dio. Now the other one, Dio Disciples, is really not around anymore. It is the hologram band.
Yeah, that's right. That's true.
Yeah, they Wendy did, I guess, endorse the Dio Disciples, but basically the Dio Disciples is morphed into what is now the Dio band playing with the hologram. That's
a subject for a whole other thing.
That is, I would love to go see it, quite honestly, just to kind of understand what it's all about. I was listening to, again, a Chris Jericho podcast, interview with Wendy Dio, and they talked about how she is on doing this tour. Ripper's one of the singers, Oni Logan's the other singer, and they basically make it a celebration of Ronnie's music. It's not a straight-up concert with just a hologram. So they'll come out with the band, and I believe Simon Wright's the drummer. I can't remember who the bass player is. It's not Claude Schnell on keyboards, but it's somebody who was with the original, or the not the original, but the last Dio band playing keyboards. And they go out, they do a few songs with Ripper, a couple with Oni, then out comes Ronnie. He does his presentation, he does 3 or 4 songs, then out comes Ripper and Oni again. Ripper and Oni do I think a duet with each other. I think they're going to try and set up a duet with or trio with Dio and the other 2.
It's definitely interesting.
I'm not against it. I want to see what it's all about.
Yeah,
I'm not going to sit there and
I can't judge it until I see it. Yeah.
And that's a lot of things. People are saying, well, that's it's blasphemous. It's this, is that. We got to see it. You got to.
Well, is it really a lot different than watching a movie with a actor that passed away? In theory.
Oh, yeah.
Really
you mean like Star Wars and Carrie Fisher?
Yeah. You go back and watch the 1977 Star Wars movie. She's passed away, but you're still watching her.
Well, it is and it isn't, but what you're seeing is something that you've never seen before. So you see a movie, you've seen that. You know it's there.
But aren't they taking basically footage of...
No, this is
all CG generated.
CGI generated.
Okay, that's different.
From scratch. And what they're using is unheard tracks from live concerts. So essentially, let's say his last tour, they recorded shows in Wisconsin, whatever. They have those tracks. They'll pull the vocal tracks from that show, and they'll give it to the creator of the hologram and say, okay, this is the vocal line you got to follow. The band is playing to a click track because they have to in order to keep up with Ronnie. But the bottom line is the band's playing live. Ronnie's doing the vocal track comes from a unspecified show.
Interesting.
So it is very interesting.
I would definitely be interested to see that, but
for sure. I mean, I wish
I'm
it would
a little
come
apprehensive at the same time.
Well, yeah. I mean, you don't know what you're getting, but apparently, I mean, they do a lot of fire, and yet there's no fire. So they do. There's a lot to the show. I understand. I mean, there's,
Then I feel it's much safer.
Yeah, they don't need to get approval from the fire department.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things that are going on in the show. From what I hear, I would love for it to come through Houston and maybe come to the House of Blues and check it out.
I mean, it's kind of interesting, and this is kind of a tangent here. But a long time ago, there was a movie, an anime movie called Macross Plus.
Okay.
And there was a singer that was all a hologram. The whole thing was she was a hologram. This character that's floating around, and it's almost like a laser show. And it sounds so similar that this concept that came around, years ago, this is kind of the same thing. It's
similar. I mean, it was introduced with, if I'm not mistaken, it was introduced with Tupac first, then Michael Jackson, because they did.
South Park did a parody of that.
So I think Tupac was the first one. I think I don't know if it was at the Grammys or one of those award shows or BET Awards. Then Michael Jackson showed up, and then. I don't know if it's the same creator, but it's the same. It's a similar technology, and apparently the technology has improved dramatically over the years. And Wendy has been the spearhead for this. And what's going to end up happening is that everyone is talking about how this is weird. It's controversial, and it may become something that is just standard. From going
well, it's
on.
already kind of going that direction. I mean, think about what we just said with Star Wars. I mean, Carrie Fisher passed away, and she was in another movie after she passed away.
Right. I mean, even better, what was his name? The guy who played Grand Moff Tarkin. He was in Rogue One, but he had passed away years earlier.
Yeah, a long time ago.
So
it's very interesting territory that we're bridging into.
But that's different because that's all computer generated per se. Where this has to, besides being computer generated, has to then be put onto a projector screen that is projected using different things, just so you can see it as a three-dimensional character in front of you. Yeah. So there's certain lines that the musicians can't cross. Obviously, you can't go and hug the guy. You can't go sing, head to head with him, on a microphone. You can't get in front of the light source. Yeah. But at the same time, there is some moving around from what I understand.
That's interesting. I want to know more about
I would love to see it. Whether or not it's good or bad, I hear it's good, but you have to see it for yourself. So Ronnie still lives somehow, some way. That's a pretty cool thing. Last but not least on this topic, we're going to touch upon Rob Halford. Rob Halford left Judas Priest in 1992. With whatever, if it was dissatisfaction with the direction the band was going in or the musical.
There were some personal issues. I mean, he had come out of the closet and some other issues that they just needed to move on at that time. So Rob left after Painkiller.
Okay.
They had some personal issues, just growing dissension, separating. Sometimes it happens. Yeah, unfortunately, with bands,
guys drift apart as far as their musical.
And you don't know what's going on in somebody's personal life that they need to deal with. So rather than letting the band fall apart and put out music where they're not happy, sometimes it's better they just separate.
Yeah, and Rob was for his part was smart, and he's the one who copyrighted the name. He's the one who copyrighted the logo or trademarked the name, copyrighted the logo, so they couldn't use the Judas Priest logo. They could still use the name. He let them use the name. He went on to make a band called Fight. The first Fight album was insanely awesome.
Very heavy.
Into the Pit slapped you so hard. I mean, it was sort of like getting punched on the Vulgar Display of Power cover from Panther. I mean, that's what it felt like. Soon as that first intro little segment went by that was quiet, and that double bass from Scott Travis came in. It was incredible.
Scott Travis, one of my favorite drummers.
He's
Russ Parrish, amazing guitarist.
Mm-hmm.
If you're familiar with Steel Panther, he's the guitarist from Steel Panther.
Satchel, right?
Yes.
Fight, they released the album, they tour behind it. They released an EP of what they call Mutations, which is a remix EP. And then they released their second album.
Which did not have Russ Parrish on it.
No, he did not. He left. The second album was A Small Deadly Space. They toured on that's when I saw Fight. And I met Rob. And embarrassingly enough, I had a camera with me that night. I had not turned the film properly in the camera, and it jammed.
Oh, man.
So I said, can I get a picture with you, Rob? And he's like, yeah, sure. Someone goes to take the picture, and it won't click. It won't move. And I was just like shrunk up to a small little boy in a corner. I was so embarrassed.
You were in a small deadly space.
Yes, I was. And I was so pissed. But he signed my stuff. He signed my Screaming for Vengeance CD, signed my Fight CD. So it was pretty cool just to get to meet him. It was real nice. After that tour, they kind of disbanded. The tour didn't go as well as they wanted. The album didn't sell as well as they wanted. And Rob still needed to experiment. He still needed to get stuff off his chest, for lack of a better term. And the 2 album, or the 2 project, came out.
Yeah, his version of 9 Inch Nails.
Yes, and that was a disaster. And from what I understand, the album was recorded in one way, which was more metal, and then between wanting to be more industrial because 9 Inch Nails and Marilyn Manson were popular, they went in that industrial sound and remixed the album, re-recorded certain parts, and it just flopped. It flopped so bad. I bought it. I tried to fake it, and I put a giant scratch in my CD, and I brought it back, I believe, to Best Buy, and all they did was replace it, and I was pissed. I was like, give me something different. This thing sucks.
I had it myself. I mean, I was one of those guys that when I like a band, I tried to find everything that the band put out and all the side projects and all that stuff. And I don't own any of my CDs anymore, but I went out and found a copy of it years later.
Wow.
And
someone still had it? They didn't burn it?
I think it was still sitting on the shelf from when it came out. Wow.
I mean,
the glue was so,
because I don't think that they ever repressed it.
Yeah.
It wasn't like they had a second run, because that surely wasn't good enough to go that way.
I just remember on the jewel case, the glue was so adhered to the album, I actually replaced the whole jewel case.
Jeez. So after that debacle, I think Rob had some deep thought about where he was going, what his direction was, and between a decision he made or an epiphany that he had, he returned and created a new band called Halford in 1999.
I think he did kind of the same thing that Bruce did. Bruce went off in a weird direction with Skunk Works, realized that it didn't work, listened to the people around him that were saying, this is not you, and went back in the direction of where he was comfortable and happy. And still experimenting to a degree, because Halford doesn't sound like Judas Priest.
It doesn't, but it does.
It doesn't, but it does. But if you stuck a Halford song in the middle of a Judas Priest album, it would sound kind of odd. It would still be like, this is a cool song.
Yeah. Where you see the similarities is when they play them live. But,
yeah, especially as they went along.
Right. Yeah. Now the Halford project was an incredible band. He basically puts together this band. They released Resurrection, and the song Resurrection, every word in that is his journey through Priest, through Fight. He even mentions Fight in there, not as a band, but just used the word fight. Something like, I got into a fight. He talks about 2. He talks about his early days in Birmingham. And then he finds himself again, basically. It was literally, the perfect title, the perfect kind of song, Resurrection. He was resurrected. The metal god came back. And that album is great. He did a duet with Bruce Dickinson, which, oddly enough, the 2 guys who went solo off their big popular bands now, did a duet together. And that kind of what ended up leading to what they were going to try and do, which is called the 3 Tremors, where it was supposed to be Bruce wanted Rob, him, and Ronnie James Dio. The record company wanted Jeff Tate. I have no idea why they wanted Jeff Tate.
It doesn't make sense.
No. Their Queensryche's popularity at the time wasn't that strong in comparison. But Ronnie James, from what I understand, is Ronnie James Dio was older at that point than those guys. And so it was more like, you don't want this guy. We want someone young to attract this crowd. It would have been terrible. So the Halford Project, Resurrection is one album. Then he does the Live Insurrection live album, and then he comes with his second album, Crucible, which came out in 2002. And then a short while later, he returns to Priest, basically later that year after Crucible was released. It really didn't go anywhere very similar to how Small Deadly Space kind of just sank. It was time. It was time for him to get back to Priest.
Yeah, a very similar journey to Bruce. And what's interesting, Roy Z worked on both Resurrection and Crucible.
Yes.
Which is funny. Another connection to Bruce's situation.
Yeah, he was the producer. He wasn't the guy.
Well, he played guitar on Crucible as well.
On Crucible or Resurrection?
Crucible. He may have played on Resurrection as well, but for sure on Crucible. I know that.
So Roy Z's got a connection. And then it also had a lot to do, I think the album, the record companies that they were associated with too had a lot to do with it. So he gets back to Judas Priest. They come out with Angel of Retribution.
Yeah, which was the perfect, is almost bizarrely similar to where they left off with Painkiller. It was the perfect follow-up. There's lots of references to the earlier career, lots of references to the Painkiller stories in that album, and it was a phenomenal return. Yeah,
that album was, it wasn't necessarily their strongest album.
No,
but it was definitely a return to form. I mean, they had two good albums with Tim Ripper Owens, with Jugulator and
I'm a fan of both of those albums. The other one was Demolition. I'm a fan of both of those albums. I really love Jugulator. It's just such a different tone to what they were doing before with Halford, where Halford kind of sang about these, messiahs and these guys that were just beyond belief, and it was almost a positive, these heroes,
right?
Whereas Ripper, the lyrics that he was writing, Jugulator was this monster that was tearing people apart, and it was almost the opposite direction,
right,
destructors of worlds.
He was a little more weird, oddly, a little more evil, I guess you say.
And there's no fault to that. They needed something different. They separated from Halford as well,
right?
And so they tried something, and it just wasn't as successful. They went from being a big stadium band to a club band.
Yeah, and unlike Iron Maiden, where Steve Harris was still the main songwriter, you can still hear Iron Maiden as Iron Maiden with Blaise Bailey.
But in a similar spectrum, Blaise didn't really take them in heights. They went from being a big band to a club band as well.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, that similarity, they parallel each other a lot in that 90s. Mm-hmm. The difference between, one and the other was that the songs still were Steve Harris songs. They were still Iron Maiden songs. They still sounded relatively similar. Just they were sung differently. And
similar to the No Prayer for the Dying and Fear of the Dark
they weren't
era.
Classic album stuff. But, when you hear songs like Sign of the Cross or The Klansman, and they're played today now, you could see Bruce doing them, or you could see, Iron Maiden doing them.
I just kind of fit them more into that time period with Fear of the Dark and No Prayer for the Dying, where they had already ventured off kind of from their classic metal roots to
the more prog stuff that they became.
Yeah.
Well, so Judas Priest, the lyrical change is what kind of set them apart from the previous Judas Priest.
Well, the guitar tone was a little different too.
I think Kaye and Glenn were going for a more heavier.
Yeah, they wanted kind of a metallic.
Yes,
is a good way.
Razor kind of sounding.
Yeah,
thing.
It's very sharp.
Right. Yeah. So that change kind of probably threw off the core fans. Even though it was heavy, it wasn't like they turned into a pop band.
Yeah.
But it was just different. And then Rob comes back, and like you said, they picked up right where
they
Painkiller left off. And I was great. And other than Nostradamus, they've really progressed with each album going forward. And Firepower, the one that came out a couple years ago, was an incredible album. I mean, Firepower really goes back into those early 80s or that Painkiller period. It's got the same sound, to a degree, but the songwriting is really good on that album. It's very strong. So they much like Iron Maiden too, they progressed a certain way. And so there's tremendous parallels between those two bands, even though they're 7 years apart in age in terms of...
Yeah, there's some odd similarities.
Yes. Rob Halford returns to Judas Priest after, it was 10 years away. Mm-hmm. Bruce was away for 6 years. Rob was away for 10 years. It has done both bands really well. And all right, so we've come to that point of the show where we're going to do the Big Four. We have a surprise this time. We got 2 Big Fours. And the reason why we have 2 Big Fours is because they're very similarly related. So the Big Four that we chose to do this week is the Big Four best replacement singers. But to go with that and contrast that, we decided, you know what? Why don't we go ahead and throw the best or the Big Four worst replacement singers? In some cases, they may or may not be the same band, but we will see. So let's go ahead and start this segment, Chris, and you're going to go ahead and do yours first.
All right, so we're starting with the best, and I'm going to go with my number 4, who is Sammy Hagar.
All right, so Sammy Hagar is my number 3.
Okay.
So we can talk about it.
So Sammy Hagar obviously came into Van Halen after David Lee Roth left. Big shoes to fill. Definitely did it with honors. I mean, 5150 was a huge hit. The next albums they had after him were all great. It wasn't as long of a time as David, but when you talk about Van Halen, there's 2 distinct eras.
Well, technically, it was longer than Dave because Dave. Well, depends on what you're talking about. Like, I'm talking about first albums. I mean, 78 to 84. It's only a 6-year period. But he was obviously Dave was there in 76 and stuff like that. From first album on, they did 6 albums compared to 4.
Yeah,
and obviously Dave's overall sold more. But the 4 albums that Sammy Hagar put out with Van Halen all 4 were huge.
Yeah, I guess you're right. It's he wasn't in the band for as long now.
Yes.
But yeah, initially his tenure was longer. You're correct.
Sorry. But the funny thing is that Sammy wasn't even the first choice to replace David Lee Roth. Do you know who the first choice was?
Who was that?
Patti Smythe from Scandal.
Really?
Yes, he was. That was the first person that Eddie reached out to replace David Lee Roth when he left, and she turned it down. Now here's one that I didn't even know. I found out today when I was doing this research. He asked someone else again before getting to Sammy.
Okay.
Daryl Hall.
Really?
Yes. It was apparently at the end of a tour.
It would have been Hall and Halen.
That would have been really funny.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, he asked Daryl Hall to join, and Daryl Hall politely declined. And it wasn't until Eddie had to get his Lamborghini fixed.
Yeah, I've heard this story multiple times.
His mechanic said, "Hey, why don't you talk to this guy Sammy that I know?" Sammy coming off of his successful solo tour for the VOA tour, I think it was, for I Can't Drive 55. They hooked up, and the rest is history.
So my number 3 is going to be John Bush.
Cool.
And
Bush.
My reasoning behind that is Joey Belladonna himself being a replacement singer. He brought the band to new heights, but what ended up happening, you have a established core audience at that point, and he's gone. And they go with John Bush, who had, again, big shoes to fill. Different sound, different singer, but can do everything that Joey could do. Meaning all the songs.
Mm-hmm, right, for sure.
There wasn't any of that old repertoire that had to be left behind. He could sing those songs.
But it was definitely, he brought a deeper tone to the vocals, and so that kind of made Anthrax almost better sounding. They were a little more aggressive sounding.
They were more aggressive, put some edge on the band that wasn't there before, and allowed them to open up their repertoire even further. They were able to do songs that, not just what they were doing before with the 80s metal, brought it into the new millennium as well.
I love John with Anthrax.
Mm-hmm. He's my favorite Anthrax singer.
And it was funny because John, he had been asked to go to Metallica and turned it down because he had Armored Saint. And they still had Armored Saint when this came up, but they had just done the Symbol of Salvation album. As good as it was, because that's an incredible album, Symbol of Salvation for Armored Saint. It really didn't go anywhere per se. It didn't break the band or anything like that. And so given this opportunity to basically get a steady paycheck, essentially, he decided I have to do this, and joined Anthrax. And I thought it was great.
It's my favorite era of Anthrax. I love those albums in comparison for sure. I've gone back and listened to more of the Joey Belladonna stuff, and I definitely respect it. But I just like that John Bush era a lot more.
Yeah, and first album that they do together, Sound of White Noise, great album. And then, essentially to cap off the career, they come around with We Come For You All after struggling to basically get a record deal, after struggling to put something cohesive together, because they had 2 albums that came out that the first one, it was Stomp 442. When that one comes out, they get dropped by the record label, so they're in hiatus. They sign with another record label, Ignition Records, I think it was, for Volume 8. The company goes kaput overnight. They've got no promotion.
Yeah, they had a rough run there, even though it was good material.
Yes.
It just unfortunately wasn't working out.
After Danny Spitz left, after the Sound of White Noise album, they really had a revolving door of guitar players. And so it was unfortunate, but it was what it was at the time. They got it all together finally, and then they re-recorded some of the Joey songs for The Greater of Two Evils. I think that's what it was, yeah. And then they came out with We Come For You All, or vice versa, I can't remember. But that We Come For You All was an incredible album.
So for number 2, I got Brian Johnson from Acdc.
Excellent choice.
A lot of things told me to put him at number 1, but I've got my reasoning for who I put at number 1. But Brian Johnson comes in after AC/DC's built up their career. We mentioned this before in I believe the last episode. They've worked so hard to get where they were, and Bon Scott passes away. AC/DC potentially is over at that point. He comes in and records their biggest album ever.
Yeah,
with Back in Black,
one of the biggest albums in the world ever.
Keeps the band alive to this day. Obviously the changes in the last couple of years with Malcolm passing away, Axl filling in after Brian, having issues with his hearing. For the greater portion of the last 40 years.
Yeah. It's 40 years this year, yeah.
He kept the band afloat, and not just afloat, but put out some amazing albums.
No, Brian Johnson stepped into a difficult situation and made it his own, and has never looked back. And so that was a great choice. It was a choice inspired by Bon, and the rest is history, as they say. 20-something million albums later.
Oh, yeah. Just a few years ago with Iron Man, reignited the interest in not just long-time fans, but new fans, young people that hadn't not necessarily ever heard AC/DC. So, yeah, Brian Johnson definitely deserves to be up there at the top.
For sure.
But above him, I put Phil Anselmo.
Seriously?
Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you why.
All right.
So, Phil comes in after 3 albums with Terry Glaze, with Pantera. And Pantera has gone nowhere. They're a relatively unknown band. They've self-produced their albums. They're a hair band. Phil comes in, puts out one hair band style album, but you can hear them changing. He's got a deeper voice, a gruffer voice, and all of a sudden they put out a masterpiece in Cowboys from Hell. He wasn't the original singer, and while most people don't know that, and they do now, and in hindsight's 2020, so we're going to go with Phil Anselmo.
In researching this project, I did kind of almost put that down. I think it was on my list of all the different ones that I put. I believe Phil Anselmo was on that list. It was one of those things where I was like, I don't know if I want to do that, because it was really before they were anything kind of changed.
But they had 3 albums that existed and were out there for people to buy.
Technically, yes.
And so why I pick him ahead of Brian is because when Brian came in, they put out their biggest album. Not everything has been the top tier great albums afterwards.
Right.
I mean, Black was the pinnacle, and then it went a little down from there, and I don't mean a tremendous amount down, but that was the best.
Yeah.
Whereas Pantera, he comes in and they just got better and better through Vulgar Display of Power, through
Far Beyond Driven.
I mean, huge.
Oh yeah, no. I mean, each album progressed and got harder and harder and harder. And even I remember saying I was working at Best Buy at the time, and The Great Southern Trendkill was coming out.
I felt like you were going to say the Great Southern Trail Mix.
Well, that Monday night, I go to put it in, and I said, can they top what they did on Far Beyond Driven in terms of getting harder? And that first song, the Great Southern Trendkill, answered it. I mean, I was blown away how much harder, faster, more extreme it was than Slaughtered, from the previous album. So I couldn't believe it. So they did what I thought they were going to do, or what I may have expected.
Oh yeah.
So it was pretty incredible. Those are 4 good choices. Of those, only one of them was one of mine. So let me go. My number 4 best replacement singer, or big 4, is Mark Tornillo from Accept.
Okay, that's a good one.
Okay, so for people who don't know Accept that well, formed in 1976, first album comes out in 79. They're a German band. The height of their success came between 82 and 86, the balls to the wall era, basically. After time with their singer Udo, he decided he wanted to do some other stuff. They're just creative differences. They had 2 reunions with Udo. They basically put the band to bed. In the late 2000s, if you want to put it that way, in 2009, they they're in New York City, and they have a rehearsal. Peter Baltus, the bass player, and Wolf Hoffman, the guitar player, are together, they're hanging out, and they hear about this guy, Mark Tornillo. They reach out to each other. Somehow they get into a rehearsal space. They start singing, and it's like magic. In my opinion, Mark Tornillo sounds a lot like Udo, but he has a different edge to him.
It's a different tone.
It's a different tone, but they both, they have that Brian Johnson sound.
But he can do the things that Udo did. Mm-hmm. He can do those, kind of like John Bush that I was describing, where he's got the same chops that he can cover what Udo did, but he does something different too. He brings something different to the table. Yes.
And so in 2009, they recorded and released the album Blood of the Nations. Incredible return to form for Accept. Andy Sneap,
honestly, heavier,
a little bit heavier.
I like. Yeah.
Andy Sneap was a huge Accept fan, and he's the one who produced the album. He went to the band and said, they sat down and they listened to Balls to the Wall, and they said, this is, or he told them, this is what I want you guys to sound. This is you. This is Accept. This is what everybody loves. And so they did that, and that's why the album was successful. And they've tried to do that over again. They've released 4 albums since then. They've been pretty good. Nothing as good as Blood of the Nations, but they've been successful. And so that's my number 4, Mark Tornillo.
It's a good choice.
Thank you. Number 3 was Sammy. We talked about him, and he was replacement singer twice. He replaced Dave both times.
That's true.
Actually, no, that's true and not true. He replaced Dave. He left. He was replaced by Gary. Well, he was replaced by Dave, who was replaced by Gary, who then was replaced by Dave, who then was replaced by Sam. It was weird how that all went.
And there was another guy in the mix at one point.
He didn't really do anything.
He never got hired officially.
Yeah.
For one day, I think it was. Yeah.
So that was number 3, Sammy Hagar. Number 2 on my list of best replacement singers is Todd La Torre for Queensryche. That's
a really good choice because he's the guy that makes me really like Queensryche.
That's cool. I like that. In 2012, the members of Queensryche, Michael Wilton, Eddie Jackson, so Michael Wilton being the guitar player, Eddie Jackson the bass player, and Scott Rockenfeld, basically got fed up with their manager, who was Susan Silver, who is Jeff Tate's wife. And they also got fed up with Miranda Tate, who was Jeff's daughter. She was running the fan club. Susan was managing them. They got tired of the basically having no say in the band. They fired Tate, and they fired Miranda Tate, and they fired Susan Silver. Jeff got upset, had an altercation with the band, and in June of that year, they fired him. because they said they came to the conclusion they can no longer work together.
It was pretty hostile. I mean, did Jeff spit on one of them?
Yeah, he spit on Scott.
Yeah.
Right during a show. So it's one of those things where it's like, how can you work with someone like that? So they returned home, and they were basically going to be on hiatus. They were told that nothing was going to happen for the next year. In that same time, they decided they wanted to work they still wanted to work. They needed to make money. They needed to earn. They made two decisions. One, they fired Jeff Tate, and they said, we're done. So they have this band they themselves, and they said, okay, we're going to bring in another singer. They had no idea who the singer was going to be, but they said, we're going to do this project. And they literally called up a venue in Washington and said, hey, we want to do 2 shows. And this is the name of the band. And it was West originally, and then they changed it to Rising West. They reached out to Todd LaTorre, or I believe a mutual friend or something like that, brought him over to Washington, had never talked to him, had never heard him sing other than what they saw on YouTube with Crimson Glory. And they were going to do this show, and it was just to rehearse so they could do this show. He was a fan of Queensryche, so he kind of knew the material, and they hit it off right away. The 2 shows were sold out. They literally got offered a management deal right after the show, and off they went. Todd was still part of Crimson Glory, but Crimson Glory ended up coming around and saying, we're not going to do anything. And he's like, you know what, I'm not hanging around to do nothing. Queensryche was ready to go. He joined Queensryche in 2014. He officially became a member of the Queensryche Corporation, or whatever it was, after the lawsuit was over between Queensryche and Jeff Tate. And they have begun as Queensryche. They've released 3 albums, all 3 progressively getting better. As you know, you like him now. We went to see him a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of an interesting thing. I never really was a big Queensryche fan. I can recognize how talented Jeff is, but his voice just didn't appeal to me in that way. I've always gone towards the heavier, more growly vocals, and I do like progressive metal as well. I mean, I like Stratovarius and some of these other bands that sing the progressive style. I'm a big Angra fan. Yeah, Queensryche just never hit a chord with me, and I think it was more because I heard Operation Mindcrime and some of the stuff after that was a little softer, and it didn't appeal to me.
The Silent Lucidity stuff.
Yeah. Now, when I listen to the new albums with Todd LaTorre, they're heavier, they're more progressive. They've got some really interesting, intricate guitar work too. And I mean, you can hear how free the band members are in comparison to how kind of chained down they were before.
It's strange because Michael Wilton now is the leader of Queensryche as their main guitar player. He was the second guitar player. Chris DeGarmo was the main songwriter. Him and Jeff were the main songwriters for Queensryche early on. And obviously Michael had his say, but the big thing about Queensryche was the dual harmony guitars. That kind of, when Chris left, that kind of got buried in the background. They weren't as progressive. And when they got Todd and they brought, they had Parker already at the end of the Jeff Tate era. Parker was all in on Queensryche, and he was real happy to do the dual harmonies. And he's a perfect complement. I mean, many years younger, but still a perfect complement to Michael's playing.
So yeah, if you're like me and you weren't a big Queensryche fan before, definitely give the new albums a chance. One of my friends who felt the same way, who's more of a death metal guy, but likes the same kind of music that I do, I showed him some of the new stuff. Light Years being one of my favorite songs on the new album. He's blown away. I mean, it's somewhere in between like Dream Theater, but it's a little more on point and less technical than Dream Theater. And
I think it's more aggressive than Dream
for sure,
Theater. Right?
But it's got those elements of very
prog.
Prog, but technical.
Yeah. Okay. So my number 1 best replacement singer, Bruce Dickinson.
Oh, yeah.
Twice.
Seems like an obvious choice.
Again, twice. Bruce Dickinson replaced Paul Di'Anno.
I'm surprised I don't have it on my list.
I was surprised you didn't myself.
I just knew you would have it there.
Okay. Well, basically, at the end of 1981, Paul Di'Anno basically wrote his death wish out of Iron Maiden between the alcohol and the drugs. Steve and Rod were looking for a new singer. They literally interviewed Bruce before he auditioned, and Bruce laid down basically laid down the law that, I'm not going to be some pushover. It's going to be this, it's going to be that, and they accepted that. And so they had a fruitful relationship for the next 10 years. Basically, that's the classic era of Iron Maiden. They released Number of the Beast, Peace of Mind, Somewhere in Time, Seventh Son, Power Slave, all those classic era albums, and I'm not including Fear of the Dark and No Prayer because they weren't classic. But those were the end. That was the end of Bruce's.
Still, people consider him part of that era because it's before Bruce left, but
right.
There's still some great songs on this album.
They are, but that after Seventh Son, that you could see there was a definitive line there because Adrian left and things changed. They went. Yeah. They were so getting into the synthesized guitars, but it went back to straight ahead rock and roll metal with No Prayer. And it was like a dead stop. They had been building up all this synth, and it's on. It just stopped. So there's a defining line there.
Again, kind of like Judas Priest with Turbo.
True, exactly. Yeah. Because when Painkiller came out, it was a defining line. It stopped.
Ram It Down was before that, but yeah.
But I think that even then, the sound of the guitars that Glenn and Kaye had on Ram It Down were still a little synth,
and certainly the drumming was
a
clear difference between Ram It Down and
I heard an interview the other day where someone gave Dave Holland a compliment.
Okay,
I was surprised. He just talked about how he was a solid in the pocket drummer, which technically he was
reliable.
Phil Rudd's reliable, but he's a lot more influential than Dave Holland. Yeah. So anyway, Bruce leaves in 1993, and Blaise Bailey is hired, does 2 albums, and then Bruce replaces Blaise
a second time.
So he, is the second singer that he's replaced in Iron Maiden.
Double replacement.
20 years later, Iron Maiden is stronger than ever, and we went to see the Legacy of the Beast tour, and that was amazing. Probably the best show I've seen, and I've seen Iron Maiden 9 times, Metallica 10 times. So that was my top 4, big 4 best singers or best replacement singers. But we're going to do the opposite now. And we're going to run this real quick. The big 4 worst replacement singers. Do you want to go first?
Yeah. I mean, so coming up with 4 was pretty easy.
Really?
But number 4...
I had a tough time.
Number 4 to me was tough because I had a few people I wanted to put in there.
All right, who you got?
It is tough for me, but with number 4, I'm going to go with Johnny Solinger.
Oof, with Skid Row.
Skid Row. Because I'm a big Skid Row fan. I loved what they did with their 3 albums with Sebastian. And so him leaving the band was necessary. It had to happen. But I honestly feel like they should not have continued as Skid Row afterwards.
I agree.
Johnny Solinger has more of a... And he's a good singer, don't get me wrong.
He's a Houston boy, isn't he?
I believe so.
Either that or he lives here now and just does all the shows. For all those people that play at the warehouse, he does all the opening act shows.
He's a great singer. No fault to him personally, but to me, he just didn't fit that. Like, they got heavier and heavier with each album with Sebastian. Mm-hmm. Even Subhuman Race, which I like, and it's not a huge hit, but it's a heavy album. It's a good album, and if you haven't given it a listen because it doesn't have hit songs on it, give it a second chance. Those 3 albums were great, and then Johnny comes in, and it's years later, but he's got a softer feel, and it's just, the attack's just not there. Mm-hmm. I just felt like they were kind of a shell of what they were with Sebastian.
Well, I agree with you on that one. But speedy recovery to Johnny. He recently got into a car accident. And,
I didn't know that. That's horrible.
He had to cancel a couple of shows here in Houston. So hopefully he recovers quickly and gets back out there.
Absolutely.
Rocking. All right, number 3.
Number 3, I'm gonna go with Gary Sharon.
Ooh, that's my number 3.
Okay. So it's again no fault to Gary Sharon.
No,
Extreme, a lot better. I'm not the biggest Extreme fan, but I definitely
for what they are, it was perfect.
Yeah, it was perfect. They had a lot of chemistry together. A great band. With Van Halen, it was just kind of a mixture of bad circumstances and just not necessarily the right fit. I tend to be of the belief that if he had come in and they had done a tour first before recording an album, they probably would have fared a lot better than they did. I don't know if it would have lasted. I don't know what would have happened. But I think that would have been a better decision than going ahead and recording Van Halen 3 without having that chemistry. Expecting magic to happen twice, lightning in a bottle twice, with like the situation with Sammy, it just wasn't the right call.
How he got the gig?
What's that?
You know how he got the gig?
How's that?
They had the same manager. So Van Halen's manager was Ray Daniels, and he also managed Extreme at the time.
Gotcha.
So he's like, "Hey, Gary, come on down here," which I think is kind of wrong. You poach your own band. It's like...
But he has, I mean, if you really listen to his vocals, he has a Sammy-like quality. And I can kind of get that, but Sammy wasn't the same as Dave either.
No.
So I don't know if that was the mentality of like, hey, they sound kind of the same, let's put them in plug and place. I just think things might have gone differently, and that we may have never gotten Van Halen 3. They may not have been successful at all, but I think it would have been a better decision to tour with him first.
I tend to agree with that. See what the fans think first. Not that you have to worry about what the fans think in general, but if you go out on tour and you get no response, then you kind of know this guy might not be the right guy.
Exactly.
So, all right, number 2.
Number 2, I'm going to go with Dan Nelson.
That's my number 2. Did you steal my list?
I did not. We don't look at each other's lists before we do this. So
that's funny.
Dan Nelson, I just thought it was kind of interesting. It's a juxtaposition against John Bush. Dan Nelson comes in after John Bush is alienated from Anthrax due to the reunion with Joey Belladonna.
If you thought Van Halen was weird when it came to singers, Anthrax was just as bad, if not worse. I mean, it's like they fire a guy because he said bad shit about the bass player, and the bass player was their good friend. So that's the first singer, and then not true. Hold on, I got that backwards. The singer talks crap about the bass player. So their first singer, can't remember his name now.
Neil Turbin
says bad stuff about Dan Lilker. They fire Dan Lilker, okay? And then to basically fire Neil because he's basically an asshole. They get Joey Belladonna. They have this successful career. Then they want to get harder. They get John Bush. And John Bush, they decide, let's get back together with Joey because we've got this tour coming up that we're being pressured to do this greatest hits or reunion type thing. They record a song together, not really together. They were never in the studio together, but they did that Ball of Confusion song, which was kind of weird. I mean, they're not together. It's not really a duet. It really doesn't do anything for the band. It's a kind of weird choice of song. Joey Belladonna doesn't come back to Anthrax, and so then John doesn't want to come back to Anthrax.
Yeah, I mean, they built up a relationship, and it's just kind of the same thing as Ronnie with Ozzy. Right. It's just, you don't want to step on those toes, and it's really unfortunate, but that's how it happened. So basically, they come along and they find this guy Dan Nelson. It's not that he's really not a good singer or anything like that. It's just he's not a good fit for the band. Not at all. Not at all. You go and you can go on YouTube. You can go on various websites. You can find these videos of him singing the song, and it's just not a good fit. It was one of those things where I think Anthrax was trying to fit themselves into a particular style that was popular at the time. With grunge being popular, they wanted someone with a rough sound, so they picked John Bush. Yeah, and Dan had that. Not deathy, but
metalcore was the big thing. American the new wave of American heavy metal. That whole scene was, people were the growls and the screams. That's what people were listening to. That's what they were into. So let's get somebody like that.
But seeing a guy like that sing Only and sing,
how was he going to do I Am the Law or anything really?
Yeah, and that's why it didn't go anywhere.
Exactly. Yeah, Dan was a failure. But he
as an Anthrax singer.
But the funny thing is that he did record the entire worship music album.
But they changed everything when
they wiped it all out.
Yeah, when they brought on Joey again.
As Torben Ulrich said, hit delete.
And number 1, I'm going to go with this guy because even though he helped or kept the band afloat I just personally never liked his vocals, and it's hard for me especially because he's following up one of my favorite singers, and that would be Blaise Bailey.
Oh, okay. I had him, but I was like, you know what? I already did enough Iron Maiden. But yeah, Blaise had a tough shoe to fill.
Yeah,
or shoes to fill.
He's coming up after Bruce Dickinson, and that's impossible to me. It really is. I personally just can't perceive anybody having the right fit for Iron Maiden after Bruce.
We started this podcast because I was listening to a bunch of podcasts myself. And one of the podcasts that I listened to is Talking Maiden with these guys from Canada. Another shout out to you guys. They love Blaise. But one of the things that they talk about when it comes to Blaise is they kind of detailed a little bit about what happened during the X Factor period and then the Virtual 11 period. And X Factor, they kind of took their time to write the album. They gelled, it was a more cohesive type of album. But when they did Virtual 11, they went into the studio with no ideas. They just banged everything out. First idea, recorded, boom, and it was on tape. And it was done. And it shows because, a song like Angel and the Gambler runs for 10 minutes and it's just this rambling of the same chorus over and over and over again. It could have easily been 4 minutes and have been probably a really good song.
Yeah.
Those are the things that hurt Blaise. The other thing is, like you said, it's just impossible to replace someone like Bruce Dickinson and be thought of as someone capable. I had mentioned this before, they didn't bring somebody in that had the same type of pipes that could re-energize the original songs. He wasn't as strong a singer as Bruce.
Well, yeah, and that's the difficulty is who can really, because Bruce has such a wide range and a high spectrum of where he can hit notes, and Blaise doesn't.
No.
For me, the biggest thing is that he took a stadium band and they became a club band, and that's Iron Maiden.
Yeah.
So,
and I saw Iron Maiden in the club with Blaise.
Yeah, and so that's really the biggest reason. It's just he just didn't have the right vibe, the right fit.
And I agree with you. I agree with you completely. All right, so you got half of my list. So my number 4 worst replacement singer, Rob Dukes for Exodus. And Exodus is another one of those bands that have had, this revolving door of vocalists, but the same vocalist. They had Paul Bailoff is their vocalist. Then he gets himself fired. They hire Steve Souza, who was fired from Testament. And, Steve Souza leaves or the band folds or something like that. Paul Bailoff comes back, does a couple albums, dies, and then so they get Steve Souza back. Mid-tour, Steve Souza quits. They get these guys to replace Steve for the end of the tour. At the end of the touring cycle, and they go to record a new album, they go to look for a new singer. They get Rob Dukes, who was in-house already because he was a guitar tech for them. So now Rob Dukes records 4 albums with Exodus, and they're not bad. His voice very similar more to Paul than to Steve, but all 3 of them have these weird, whiny, screamy voices, almost like someone grabbed Brian Johnson's junk and squeezed tight, and that's basically the way it sounds, And again, it works for them, but I've never been a huge fan of Exodus. They have a couple of songs that I like, Piranha and Toxic Waltz, but nothing extravagant.
To be honest, I haven't really heard much of the Rob Duke stuff. I heard some of the very early Exodus albums, but they've just never been a huge one on my radar.
I mean, they were playing. I mean, that the Rob Dukes era was, or actually basically the last Sousa album that they did, and then from there on, they've been kind of this really hard, almost like a hardcore thrash band. And which is fine. It suits them. That's their thing. It's like almost Slayer-esque, kind of without the, and even in some cases some evil lyrics. So that's number 4. Number 3 was Gary Sharon from Van Halen, for the same reasons we discussed. Number 2 was Dan Nelson for the same reasons we discussed, for Anthrax. And then my number 1 was John Corabi, Motley Crue.
He was on my radar as far as one of these, but yeah.
To me, that's a bigger failure than Blaise with Iron Maiden. The reason why is because he was brought in for all the wrong reasons.
Oh, completely. And you talk about somebody that doesn't sound anything like the previous regime.
Right. Exactly.
Just completely different direction.
I mean, I personally don't know what they were thinking per se when they said, "Hey, let's get John Corabi." It's fine. It meshed well in terms of music, but it wasn't Motley Crue.
No.
And that's where it failed.
And especially the fact that they called the album Motley Crue.
Yes. You self-titled the album. So, to me, that's supposed to be a rebirth. Motley Crue is there's a sound to Motley Crue. And even with that, Vince Neil's voice changed on every single album. Okay. So every single album sounded different. It was produced differently. His vocals were different, for whatever reason they changed in each album. John Corabi joining Motley Crue to me was just a monumental mistake. Even he knew it when the time came. He's the one who said, "Nick, you need to bring Vince back." I mean, he basically fired himself from the band. The whole thing with Vince was just if you can read through the lines in the movie The Dirt, what really happened with Vince was not. I don't think it was drugs or alcohol or anything like that, because they were all, wasted characters. The band had one agenda. Vince Neil was going through some personal tragedy with the death of his daughter. Or the sickness of his daughter, her having cancer, and then her dying. I mean, that weighs a lot on someone. And, you don't necessarily focus your job. You're not focused on doing your job. So I think it was a kind of a messed up thing to have happen the way it did. But it happened. They hired John for all the wrong reasons. He's my number one.
All right, so tonight we talked about artists going solo and our big four replacement singers, both good and bad. Well, that's it for Debating Metal this week. You can listen to us on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, Podbean, or wherever you consume your podcasts. If you enjoyed our show and agreed with our opinions, or just want to rip us a new one, check us out on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, or you can email us at debatingmetal@gmail.com. I'm Chris Kaye, and on behalf of Kenneth Dean, we'll see you next week.
Bye.